Hello, class. I'm back. This is lecture number 27 for History 101. And when we left off, President Polk was on the verge of two wars at once if he wasn't careful. So, what he's obviously going to do, if you're faced with the possibility of having wars on two of your borders with two different countries, you settle with the powerful country, the superpower England, and go to war with the weaker nation. And that's exactly what Polk did. He'll enter into negotiations with the British. They'll settle on the 49th parallel, which the British thought we had settled back in 1818 with the Rush-Bagot Treaty. And we'll end up going to war with Mexico. Now, if you take a look at the map on page 377 in your book, it illustrates this war. And one thing you'll notice from this map, what I've been telling you before, look how gigantic Mexico is. It's all of the southwestern United States and parts of Oklahoma and half of Texas. That area that's highlighted with the sort of blue border, that's known as the disputed territory. Now, this is part of the reason why this war begins. We had just annexed Texas, which was the present-day eastern half of Texas. That other part, highlighted there, both Mexico and the Texans had always claimed since 1836, the end of the Revolution. So, that's what's really at stake here. And this war, as Santa Anna promised, he said, if you annex Texas, which is the eastern half, I'm going to war with you, which they did. Now, in this war, the United States has, as you'll notice, really two major generals that engage in this war. Well, actually three that will all become politically significant later. Now, the two generals in question here who are basically going to have a race between each other to see who can finish off the Mexicans first, because we're going to enter this war very confident and cocky. In fact, later on, we'll be talking about the Wilmot Proviso, which basically is a plan in Congress that we'll talk about in detail later because it's more related to the Civil War, where we're determining the fate of territory acquired before we even win the war. So you have General Winfield Scott, who you can see invades Mexico from first coming by sea from New Orleans. And then the other major general who's in this race to win the war will be General Zachary Taylor. Now, the two of them are going to be fighting this war. The third general that you'll notice while we got the map open, who is engaged in battles in the northern frontier of Mexico, is Fremont, who will become a factor later on. And you'll recognize his name because he'll be the first Republican candidate for the presidency in the 1850s. So, Zach Taylor and Winfield Scott are in a race to see who can beat the Mexicans first. And we believe it's going to be basically a cakewalk of a war when we engage in this battle. But the Mexicans are going to give us much more than what we bargained for in this particular war. And just a second here. I got to find some more of my notes here. Bear with me for a second. So in this war, thanks for being patient. These two are racing to see who can polish off the Mexicans first. But as you'll notice, The actual war begins in September of 1846 when we invade Mexico. This war is going to drag on all the way till September of 1847, much to the chagrin of the Americans who thought they could polish them off in a matter of months. Now, to show you how cocky these two generals were, namely Zach Taylor and Winfield Scott, both of them bring State Department negotiators with them on the battlefield because both of them operate under the assumption the very next battle could be the end. And I want to be the one to be known as the one who won the war, negotiate a quick settlement to it, so I'll be the hero of the Mexican-American War. So the race is on between Scott and Zach Taylor. Both will gain fame in this war, and the war will all boil down to final battles that happen in the Mexico City area with General Winfield Scott in September of 1847. By that point, the United States military has the upper hand in Mexico. The Mexicans are slowly but surely being ground down because they're spread out over a large area of territory. And ultimately, what's going to happen here is Scott and the U.S. forces will have the capital city of Mexico City surrounded. And they'll send in an ultimatum. Negotiate an end to this war now, or we'll destroy your capital city, and we have the military might and power to do so. And the Mexicans knew it. So, negotiations will follow in a small suburb outside of Mexico City, the suburb of Guadalupe, Hidalgo. That's why the treaty that ends the Mexican-American War is the Treaty of Guadalupe, Hidalgo. Now, here's how this treaty pans out. We have firmly militarily defeated the Mexicans, even though it took much longer than we anticipated, and it's going to, cause a lot more loss of life than anybody anticipated too, and I'll cover that shortly. So, the first thing that the Americans demand at the negotiation table is that disputed area we've been talking about, which is the western half of Texas, going into northern reaches, the panhandle of Texas and whatnot, and even parts of present-day New Mexico. They have to just give us that for the spoils of war, as it's known. We won, this is what you hand over. That was common back in this day and age. The second thing that the Americans demand becomes known as the Mexican Cession. It's that whole area of territory outlined in sort of orange. The entire states of California, Nevada, Arizona, parts of Colorado, New Mexico. We had attempted earlier, a few years earlier, to buy that from Mexico, and they refused. So now we tell them, you want to sell us the Mexican Cession, don't you? Now remember, we have their capital city surrounded and we've threatened to destroy it. And they know we're not joking. So they kind of said, yeah, sure. Then the American negotiators said, and we'll pay you $15 million for the Mexican Cession. And the Mexican negotiators say, sure, great. So they end up selling us all that territory in 1847. Actually, it becomes official in 1848 of the Mexican Cession for $15 million. Let's think about what a bargain discount price that was. As you'll remember, Nearly 45 years earlier, that's the price we paid for the Louisiana Territory. You think the value of land's gone up a little bit in 45 years? We pay the same exact price for that gigantic area of territory. And as we'll find out very quickly, boy, did we make out like bandits. So, that's the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And now, really, with the addition of the Oregon country becoming officially part of our territory before the war, and all of this addition of territory, Manifest Destiny has become complete very quickly as far as control of territory. So, as far as the cost of war, even though everybody thought it was going to be this walk in the park cakewalk, the United States lost 13,000 men in the Mexican-American War. Some Mexican-American veterans came from the North Country, and a lot of them went back and settled in a place up here in northern New York that you may have heard of before. Churubusco. The original settlers of Churubusco were all Mexican-American war veterans, and they had all participated in a very famous battle in that war, the Battle of Churubusco. So that's where that little burg in the North Country gets its name from. Just a little trivia tidbit for you. Now, also, as far as the Mexicans are concerned, they're going to lose somewhere in the neighborhood of 50,000 soldiers. So all told, approximately 63,000 men lose their lives in this what was supposed to be a cakewalk of a war. Pretty bloody. Now, the long ongoing price of this war. Mexico never really wanted to sell the Mexican Cession. We forced them to do that at gunpoint. Now, still to this day, and it's become more magnified lately with the supposed building of a wall along the border, there are a lot of Mexican citizens who are taught in their schools that the United States stole the Mexican Cession from them, and it really should be part of Mexico. So when Mexicans cross the border into places like Arizona and California, many Mexicans feel like they're just going to their own country. And this was an artificial creation that should have never happened, and it happened at gunpoint. And really, truly, they've got a point. So we still struggle with the results of this war today with the problems of immigration between Mexico and the United States. And I can see all perspectives, but you got to also look at the Mexican perspective in this, because all that territory used to be part of Mexico. So, the other thing we want to talk about is how damn lucky we are. We officially take control of the Mexican Cession in 1848. The very next year, in 1849, gold is discovered on the American River southeast of San Francisco, and the gold rush is on in California, which has only been an American possession for a year. Now, if Mexico had known that billions of dollars worth of gold lay below the soil in the state of California, and even more in Nevada and so forth, I highly doubt they would have been so willing to sell us the Mexican Cession for a measly $15 million when it was worth billions and billions. And in fact, there was a Mexican prospector who was prospecting in the San Gabriel Mountains outside of present-day Los Angeles, who had discovered gold there. And he reported this to the Mexican government, and they thought he was a crackpot and was pulling their leg. Boy, I wish, I'm sure they wish they'd have listened to him. So, the brand new state of California will come online the next year in 1850, and we'll be talking about that in the future. But it's a pretty quick progression of events going from California being part of Mexico until 1848, and by 1850, so many people have flocked there in the gold rush that it's applying for statehood and is that populated. America just lucked out with the Mexican Cession. There's no doubt about it. Now, what we want to do next is we want to go back to some of the chapters that we skipped. And the first thing that we want to talk about is kind of related to the gold rush in California in 1849, or the 49ers. And we want to take a look on page 307, because there we have a map of the West. And we want to talk about, not only the people flocking by trails to California for the gold rush. And remember, people came from all around the world for the gold rush. Some people literally traveled there, traveling by the Butterfield Overland Trail and the old Spanish Trail and whatnot. Others went there by ship, going around the tip of South America from the East Coast. People flocked to California from Asia. The original Chinese immigrants came there as gold prospectors. People even traveled there from Europe with gold fever. So that's how California became populated so quickly in 2 years. Now, another thing that we want to focus in on this map on page 306, and now we're back in chapter 13 that we skipped, is the Oregon Trail. A lot of people travel by wagon train out to Oregon, especially after it officially became part of the United States in 1847. And many of you, probably as children, played the video game, the Oregon Trail video, of pioneers traveling out there in wagon trains and so forth. So I know my children did, and I played it with them. There were a lot of trials and tribulations on the Oregon Trail, that's for sure. And it was a hard way out there. But a lot of brave settlers ended out up in the northern Pacific coast following the Oregon Trail for farmland and other opportunities, not for the gold that the people traveled to California for. Now, also what you'll notice on this map is the famous Mormon Trail. And we want to speak about that for a second. The Mormon religion is a religion that was created right here in the United States. In fact, it was created in the state of Vermont. Now, the Mormons have always been the subjects of prejudice, and ultimately they're going to be pushed out of Vermont and New York State all the way to a place called Nauvoo, Illinois. Now, the founder of the Mormons, his name slips my mind right now. I'll get back to you with that next lecture. I'll look it up. I can't remember his name. I think I'm not going to guess. He ends up being murdered in Nauvoo, Illinois, because of, religious racism. The person who picks up where he left off, I think the guy's last name was Smith, an easy name, but I may be wrong. Joseph Smith was the founder of the Mormon religion. He's murdered in Nauvoo. After this horrible event, the new leader of the Mormon religion emerges, and that's somebody you're probably more familiar with. That person's name is Brigham Young. Now, Joseph Smith founded the religion in Vermont. He was born over in eastern Vermont, near, in a little burg near Woods, not too far from Woodstock, and Sharon, Vermont, in fact. So Brigham Young will take all the Mormons and take them out on the Oregon Trail, and they'll settle on the Great Salt Lake north of present-day Salt Lake City, Utah. Now, when they make their trek out there, the Great Salt Lake and Utah was part of Mexico. This was before the Mexican-American War and the Mexican Cession. This was in the early 1840s. So what Brigham Young thinks he's doing is taking the Mormons to the middle of nowhere, to the far northern reaches of Mexico, where they can settle, practice their religion, practice their traditions like polygamy, and no one will give a damn because they're in the middle of nowhere. Well, before they know it, the Mexican-American War happens, the Mexican Cession takes place, and now they're back in the United States where they really don't want to be because they've been the victims of prejudice in Vermont, in New York, in the Rochester area, in Palmyra. They were run out of there. They're run out of Nauvoo, Illinois, and now they're in the Utah territory. This is going to cause conflict between the Mormons and the United States government, especially over their practice of polygamy. But they're stuck in the United States again, and they got to abide by our laws. Kind of ironic how they thought they were in the middle of nowhere in the northern reaches of Mexico, and it changes overnight for them. So, a couple other things that we want to take a look at in this chapter that are noteworthy. On page 287, we have a chart that I want you to look at the bottom. That's Irish and German immigration by decade between 1830 and 1900. Now, as many of you are very aware of, the real influx of Irish into the United States, and especially to the cities of the East Coast like Boston and New York, really picked up in the 1840s, and you can see that on the chart. In the previous decade, only 207,000 Irish people immigrated to the United States. The next decade of the 1840s, almost 800,000 immigrated here. And I'm sure you're all taught in grade school, the reason why is the Great Potato Famine in Ireland. Potatoes were the staple food source of the Irish because it's one of the few things they could grow in their very cold, rocky soil. A blight hit the potato in Ireland and wiped out all the crops. It destroyed potato growth there. And they had no solution for it immediately. So there was a famine where people literally had to liquidate everything they owned in Ireland by ship passage to America, the land of opportunity, and get jobs in the industry that was popping up in places like New York City and Boston. And that immigration will even increase further in the 1850s. You can see over 900,000 Irish came. So there's a great influx of Irish just before the Civil War begins in 1861. But what a lot of people don't realize is the decade of the 1850s, because of political turmoil and other factors in Germany, even more Germans came to the United States from Germany. So there's a big wave of immigration. This will become significant for both political reasons and military reasons. All these immigrants are going to settle in the North. The North is going to grow tremendously in population because of this. And they'll soon become voting members of our society, the males. They'll have influence on political outcomes, and also many of them, especially the Irish, will end up serving in the Union Army during the Civil War. They weren't flocking to the South because there were no industrial jobs for them there. Now, the other thing we want to look at today while we're in that chapter is on page 305. On page 305, you have a map that shows us railroad construction in America, between 1850 and 1860. Now, if you take a look at the blue lines on the map, that's all the railroads that were in existence by 1850. So there's a tremendous amount of railroad expansion between 1850 and 1860. And a couple factors are at play here. A tremendous amount of industrialization takes place in the North because you'll notice the overwhelming majority of these railroad lines are in what becomes the Union, or as they're labeled, free states on this map. Another big factor happened in the mid-1830s. A gentleman by the name of Peter Cooper was the first American to successfully build a locomotive here in the United States. It took him a while to get his factories in place, but they were in place by the 1840s, and our initial growth in railroads will be because they're much more affordable. Before Peter Cooper constructed a locomotive in the United States, we used to have to import them from England. And you can imagine how expensive they were to put on a ship and ship across the Atlantic to the United States. So, another factor that I want you to notice on this map while we have the page open is, as I mentioned before, the overwhelming majority of railroads constructed in the up to 1850 and then 1850 to 1860, and remember, the Civil War begins in 1861, are in the North. The lines down in the South are what are known as trunk lines, many of them. They'll start in the interior and end at a port city, like in Georgia, or go across the Florida Peninsula. Or there's lines that go to the Mississippi River, like the line in Louisiana, Mississippi there. The whole purpose of those were to take cotton, get it to a port city, get it on a ship, and either ship it to northern mills in the United States or over to England. That's their only purpose. They weren't really there for any sort of other transportation because the South had no industry. So, all the lines in the North are connecting an industrial network. We're already starting to work our way to the Civil War. This is a gigantic advantage for the Union. They have this complete transportation network in the North that not only allows them to transport supplies and materials of war, but to transport troops with lightning speed. And there's no way for Southerners to disrupt this. An invading army is not going to be able to destroy enough railroad tracks to disrupt travel in the North. In the South, it's a different story. These trunk lines are easily disabled. And in fact, in the state of Georgia, William Tecumseh Sherman in his famous March to the Sea in 1864 will completely disable all the rail lines in Georgia in short order because he'll have his troops just pull up a couple miles of rail, heat up a big bonfire of rail ties, and bend them into tie shapes. They're known as Sherman bow ties. You can never, ever straighten out a rail that a train can ride on it again. And all the rails are produced in the iron and steel mills in the North. So you destroy 2 miles worth of track, that whole rail track is disabled. Never to be fixed again, especially by 1864 until after the war. Gigantic advantage for the Union in the North during the Civil War. This map illustrates it perfectly. So, that's it for me today. I'm running out of voice. I'll be back in a few days to pick up where we left off. And I hope you all have a good weekend. Take care. See you soon.